Hey, good morning, CrossPoint. This morning's devotions will be reading out of Daniel chapter 6, verse 4 to 10. And I'll go ahead and read it to you. It says, "At this time, the administrators and the satraps tried to figure grounds to charge against Daniel in his conduct of the government affairs. But they were unable to do so. They could not find corruption in him because he was trustworthy, neither corrupt or negligent. Finally, these men said, we will never find any basis to charge against this man Daniel unless it's something to do with the law of his God. So the administrators and the satraps went as a group to the king and said, 'May King Darius live forever.' The royal administrators, prefects, and satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days except to you, your majesty, shall throw him into the lion's den. Now, your majesty, issue the decree and put it in writing so that it cannot be altered, in accordance with the law of the Medians and the Persians, which cannot be repealed.' So King Darius put the decree in writing. Now when Daniel learned about the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room, where the window was open towards Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to God, just as he'd done before." This morning, we're looking at Daniel because something happened on July 1st. We're in the midst of this whole coronavirus, and things have kind of taken place. And then we've had this spike that has taken place in this really across the nation, but particularly in California, we've seen this spike. And on July 1st, the governor released additional guidelines of how to stave off this the spread of the coronavirus. And one of the pieces, controversial guidelines that he recommended or he enacted was a guideline that had to do with worship. It says this straight from the guideline. It says, "Places of worship must therefore discontinue singing, chanting, activities, and limit indoor attendance to about 25% of the activity's capacity." And so this caused a lot of controversy within the church. A lot of people felt like this was an overreach, and how can a governor tell us that we can still gather and yet not worship and sing? In fact, as Christians, we're called to sing. It's a commandment to sing. Exodus 5, verse 1 and 21 says, "I will sing to the Lord, for he is exalted." 1 Chronicles 16:23 says, "Sing to the Lord, all you earth." Psalm 7:17 says, "I will give thanks to the Lord because he is righteous. I will sing praises to his name." Psalms 13:6, I will sing the Lord's praises, for he has been good to me. Psalm 68, sing to God. Psalms 96, verse 2, "Sing to the Lord, praise his name, proclaim his day's salvation." Over and over in the scriptures, we're told to sing to the Lord. And yet, today we live in a time where now our governor of the state of California has come to us and told us not to sing. It's not allowed to sing. And so we can have several responses to this. And in fact, we've seen churches and Christians respond to this in very different ways. And let me simply just say this here. Based off this Daniel text and kind of what we're getting into this morning, I want to address a couple things. First is we ought not worship or sing with defiance in our heart. It shouldn't be out of rebellion. If you read throughout the scriptures, the one thing that we notice about worship is it should always be about God. It should always be in response to who God is and what he's done and his goodness, and flat out because he's worthy of worship and praise. If we approach singing and we gathered to sing for the sake of just, defying the governor's law, we've missed the point of worship. Worship is not meant to have defiance in our heart. It's not meant as a protest. In fact, even there was a time when something similar to this happened in the scriptures where Jesus' disciples were singing praises about Jesus, and the Pharisees came to Jesus and says, "Hey, Jesus, make them stop." And what Jesus said is really interesting. He doesn't say, "Well, disciples, sing even more louder," or "Disciples, sing." What Jesus says is very interesting. He says to the Pharisees, he says, if they don't sing, the rocks will cry out and sing the praises of God. Why? Because God alone is worthy. The motive of worship ought not be rebellion. It ought not be defiance. It should be out of reverence and the worthiness of God. The second thing I want to point out from this text from Daniel is if you look at Daniel's response to this new edict, he was basically told, you can't pray, you can't worship God for the next 30 days. It was temporary. I'm assuming the governor's guidelines is temporary as well. But what does Daniel do? Does he go gather and worship even more and louder? No, what he does is the text says in It says that he does what he normally does. Verse 10, he says he goes and he prays 3 times a day. He got down on his knees, give thanks to God, just as he done before. See, when we're asked to do something that is outside of that, the question is, are we worshiping regularly? Is it part of who we are? Is it a response to who we are? What I'm afraid of that so often with this is that people will respond to this governor's guidelines in defiance versus actually worshiping God for who he is. And the third thing that I want to point out is our worship should not be religious. And let me kind of clarify this. James talks about what true religion is, and it's a care, and he talks about the orphans and the widows, but really worship is not just the act of singing, but it is the whole of our lives. And particularly, sometimes there are times that maybe gathering is in places of worship together is not the best for our neighbors. 1 Corinthians 10:23-24 says, basically everything's permissible, but not everything's necessarily beneficial. It's this principle that, we have the freedom to gather and worship. And in fact, we should gather and worship, but sometimes for the sake of our neighbors, we ought not. Now, I'm not saying that Sunday evenings we shouldn't gather. I'm happy to do that. But maybe for some of us, instead of gathering just for the sake of, if you're feeling sick or you just don't, you're feeling uncomfortable about all these regulations, maybe just approach it slightly different from the perspective of I'm loving my neighbors and I'm worshiping God. So 3 things from this text to kind of point out again. Number 1, we ought not worship out of defiance. We ought not sing to God out of defiance towards any other system. Our worship should strictly and purely be directed towards God and because of who God is. Second, worship ought to be regular. It should just be a part of our lives. It's almost as if Daniel is like, well, this is the new rule. I'm not going to change my routine. If this is partly of who we are on a regular basis, keep singing, keep worshiping. It doesn't stop you from singing all out at home. And thirdly, is worship shouldn't be religious in the sense that it only cares about doing it for the sake of doing it. That you ought to consider worship as a way of just loving other people as well, loving God and loving others as well. And sometimes that might mean turning the TV on Sunday mornings for the live stream and singing your heart out so your neighbors could hear you. And other times it might be to gather. But for the most part, I'm concerned a little bit about the response that a lot in the Christian communities had towards this guidelines. That it's, yes, in so many ways it's an overreach, but in another time, many ways we have to approach it not defile our worship, not compromise the heart of worship, but understand that worship is because God's worthy of it, and approach it in that way. And with that, so my challenge for everybody, my prayer for everybody is when you gather on Sundays, when you sing at home, a couple questions to ask yourself. Number 1, is it regular? Do you do it on a regular basis? Number 2, when you do sing, is it out of defiance or any other reason that is not directed towards who God is and the worthiness of God? And number 3, is your worship religious? Are you just doing it to be seen as the Pharisees did, or are you doing it because you love God, and are you doing it to love your neighbors? Even though it's permissible, it's not necessarily beneficial. So I challenge you with that, to think through that through, and God bless you, and I miss you all.